The first sprint weekend of the F1 fantasy season is underway, and we finally have real data to work with. Free practice 1 and sprint qualifying are in the books, and now we have a much clearer picture of the pecking order in China. So in this video, we're going to break down the biggest takeaways from FP1, what sprint qualifying told us about the running order for the weekend, review the updated betting lines, and most importantly, which chips actually make sense this weekend. Let's get you ready to lock in your F1 fantasy lineup for the Chinese Grand Prix. So free practice 1 started with some drama because Lindblad missed most of the session with a reliability issue. Meanwhile, over at Red Bull, Verstappen finished P8 and Hadjar P13, and this is a trend that carried through to sprint qualifying. McLaren took advantage of that opening in the top 5 and jumped ahead of the Ferrari duo of Charles Leclerc and Lewis Hamilton. Mercedes was dominant once again, and they were a half-second clear of Lando Norris. Moving on to sprint qualifying, we started SQ1 with the news that Sergio Perez wouldn't be taking part in the session, so he'll start at the back of the grid for the sprint. It's a reminder that Cadillac's reliability is going to be a real concern for us for the first part of the season, and we should avoid them in our F1 fantasy lineups. We had Cadillac, Aston Martin, and Williams knocked out first in SQ1. Moving up the timing sheets, Racing Bulls had a bit of a disappointment in SQ2. They finished P13 and P15, but there could be some opportunities for overtakes in the sprint. In SQ3, it was all Mercedes once again, but the big story here was that McLaren topped Ferrari for the second straight session. We had Norris, Hamilton, Piastri, and Leclerc taking P3 through P6 and setting up difficult decisions for those Limitless users. Before we go any further, if you're enjoying the video, please hit like and subscribe. It really helps small creators like me to keep making content like this. Now, when we look at the updated betting lines, Russell and Antonelli continue to build their lead at the top. But what I find interesting is that despite McLaren's success over Ferrari in FP1 and sprint qualifying, Vegas still has Ferrari pulling ahead on Sunday. I think this is because Ferrari used their Macarena wing in FP1, so sprint qualifying was their only session with a normal rear wing. So I've got to imagine they're going to improve as the weekend rolls on, and that's why Vegas has them over McLaren, despite what we've seen in these two sessions. For those of you considering Haas versus Racing Bulls as your second constructor, these lines are telling us that Haas have the advantage so far on pure pace. But what they don't tell you is that Racing Bulls still have great pit stops. So for F1 fantasy purposes, I do still like them this weekend. If you're considering Limitless, I just pick from the top of this list, with Russell, Antonelli, Leclerc, Hamilton, and Norris as your drivers. Now let's talk chips, because there are a few that really stand out this weekend. And we'll start with the two we discussed earlier this week in the team selection video. Wildcard is a great option if you need to pivot away from some of the drivers who retired early in Australia. I'm talking about Oscar Piastri, Isaac Hadjar, Nico Hülkenberg, and Valtteri Bottas. I expect most of them to bounce back soon, but a DNF is going to hurt their 3-race average, and that could lead to a price drop. So here's how I'm thinking about it. If you need 4 or more transfers to build a top lineup, use Wildcard. If you only need 3 moves, I'd probably just take the -10 transfer penalty and save Wildcard for later. The biggest debate of the week has got to be whether or not we should play Limitless. And obviously the appeal's simple. It lets you run the most expensive assets on the grid and potentially score way more points than a normal lineup. But this week has an extra special advantage, because if your cost cap grew 2 million or more in Australia, your Limitless team actually reverts back to your Australian lineup before those price changes are applied. That means you could combine a huge score with another big cost cap gaining week. But there's some risk we should consider. We only have one free practice session and sprint qualifying this weekend to understand the running order and reliability risks. There's an extra part for my session after the sprint, so teams could make some tweaks to the car that impacts the running order. Plus, we also saw with McLaren starting to upset Ferrari at the top of the grid in free practice 1 and sprint qualifying that we don't have a firm sense of who that second top constructor is. Here's how I'm handling it. If you have 3 teams, since they're all eligible for prizes this year, it absolutely makes sense to try Limitless on one of them. It's one of the top strategies for this weekend, so it's worth a shot. But if you only have one team, I'm personally leaning toward holding onto Limitless. I'd rather get one more race of data before committing to such a powerful chip. Plus, McLaren's performance on Friday has made me just uncertain enough that I don't want to take any chances of getting it wrong. Now, speaking of when to use Limitless, let's get into our viewer mailbag because our friend Jason asks, will Limitless be better used in Monaco, Japan, or Jeddah? I'll go through them in order. Japan stands out for me because we're going to have the higher scores from the sprint weekend in China, so those lineups are probably safe for more cost cap gains. Plus, in Japan, we're going to have 3 free practice sessions, and that's going to help us make sure we have the very best Limitless teams and the running orders clear. Looking over at Jeddah, it was the second best circuit for Limitless last season, but it is at risk of being canceled, so we have to keep an eye on that situation. If the race still goes on, this is a low overtake circuit, so those midfield drivers are likely going to have lower scores compared to Limitless teams. But on the flip side, that also might slow down the cost cap gains for budget drivers, so it's not a perfect solution for cost cap gains and scoring. Monaco is always great for Limitless because there's hardly any overtaking, but we've got to be careful. On June 1st, the power unit testing protocol is changing, and Monaco is the very first race after those hot engine tests are implemented. So will that change bring Mercedes back into the clutches of Ferrari and Red Bull? Limitless could be a tough decision if Mercedes lose that advantage, and we only have free practice to figure out what that means for the running order. So in short, I'm looking at Japan, followed by Jeddah, then Monaco to use Limitless. Our next question comes from Finn Mahana. Any reason not to run the 3x boost on George and Kimi this week? We're so hardwired to save the 3x boost until we can afford more expensive teams later in the season, but Mercedes look so good right now, this might actually be a safer play this week than Limitless. Will we have 2 drivers this far out in front later in the season? I'm not sure. So I don't hate the idea, but I tend to play a conservative game and will probably hold off on my team 1 and keep building budget. But again, if you play 3 teams, this isn't a bad idea for China. As for who to pick on your team this week, let's check out the updated tier list. So after free practice 1 and sprint qualifying, the Red Bull assets slide all the way down to the cell category. Now, if this was FP3, I'd keep them on the fence since they're really good at making corrections, but this was a competitive session and they didn't have the pace at all. Verstappen and Hadjar are starting the sprint P8 and P10, and I don't have a lot of faith that they're going to move much higher than that. I bumped up Norris and McLaren since they looked promising, but if you have Ferrari, I'd be fine holding on to them. They still have their really fast pit stops, and the Vegas lines confirm that they should be moving up as the weekend moves on. Looking over at Tier B, it mostly stays the same since the beginning of the week, with Perez now a sell after not taking part in sprint qualifying. And finally, here are the top teams I'm looking at this weekend. Plan A for me is just running back my team from Australia. Now, I have Antonelli and Colapinto instead of Leclerc and Bortoleto, but if you have a team like this, you have the 2 most likely Tier A drivers and the 3 most likely Tier B drivers to go up in price. So why not just roll a transfer to Japan and grow your cost cap some more? I think I'll be heading toward 2 Tier A constructors soon, and some of you may want to try that approach as early as this weekend. I suspect this team is going to score a bit more than the last one, but there's also a higher risk of DNFs and fewer opportunities for cost cap growth. With this team, Charles Leclerc is the best 2x boosted driver we could have in this lineup, but between Leclerc, Mercedes, and Ferrari, we should get a ton of points. Last but not least, we saw this trend in the betting lines earlier, but if you run Limitless, this is the best of the best. I trust George with the 2x boost since that Mercedes is flying, and also I'd get a little bit of coverage of McLaren since they have been on the rise this weekend. I trust Ferrari as the second constructor just because I like their pit stop performance, and it's a good hedge between Lando and the Ferrari constructor, but you're welcome to mix and match as you see fit. That's all for now. We'll be live tonight to answer all of your questions 1 hour before the start of the sprint race. The action begins at 10 p.m. Eastern on Friday, 2 a.m. in the UK on Saturday, right here on the FanAmp YouTube channel. Thanks so much for watching.